Close your eyes and imagine a city. Any city. It could be Boston, but it could be another city. Now, think about the really beautiful schools in that town, that city, that place. Who goes to those schools? Now think about the not-so-nice schools in that city and who attends those schools.
Welcome to the Cambridge Forum discussing privatizing education and the health of democracy with education policy expert Julian Vasquez Heilig. I'm Susie McClone, a teacher in the Boston Public Schools, and I will be your moderator. Our conversation will explore the relationship between public education and the health of our democracy. How are today's calls for education reform linked to privatization efforts? What does privatization feel like inside the classroom? Our speaker, Julian Vasquez Heilig, is currently a professor of educational leadership and policy studies at California State University, Sacramento. In addition to his academic work, Heilig has held a variety of research and practitioner positions in organizations from Boston to Beijing, which have given him a perspective to bridge research, theory, and practice. Welcome, Julian Vasquez Heilig.
Let me begin by introducing the idea, aristocratic school reform. I argue that aristocratic school reform has four main components. First, it's reformed, controlled behind the scenes by the elites. It's top-down. These are policies that are designed by the federal government, by the state government, and trickle down to the local communities. There's opportunity for profit and privatization in these policies. And finally, and most importantly, as you saw with the announcement about charters today here and lifting the cap in Massachusetts, an elegant but false narrative of nobility wrapped in civil rights and economic efficiency. These are components of what I'm calling aristocratic reform. Who underwrites aristocratic reform? For example, the Democrats for Education Reform is a political action committee supported largely by hedge fund managers. They favor charter schools, high-stakes testing, school choice, including vouchers and tuition tax credits, which I call money-laundering voucher schemes. There are many examples of aristocratic education reform that could be discussed here today, but I will focus on just a few of the hot topics that we're discussing now in March of 2015. Chicago's a hot topic right now because of the impending mayoral runoff. Rahm Emanuel, also known as Rambo, is a famous bundler of Wall Street and other big money. And he's brought his brand of aristocratic reform to Chicago. The mayorally appointed school board in Chicago has been keen on closing schools, especially those in minority communities, and then sending those same students to low-performing schools after closing their schools. Across the nation, legislators are also simultaneously filing bills to create so-called achievement districts. Is this purely a coincidence? Wholly spontaneous? ALEC, a lobbying organization conglomerate of corporations, has spread model legislation across the nation seeking to take the chartering of schools out of the hands of local officials and place it in the hands of politically appointed charter boards. You have a similar and parallel approach in the Recovery School District in New Orleans and the Achievement School District in Tennessee. More recently, in Texas, a group of wealthy businessmen bankrolled an attempted hostile takeover of the entire Dallas school district under an obscure Texas charter law from the 1990s called Home Rule. Fortunately, the community pushed back, and the takeover recently fell through. Regardless, the Achievement School District approach has failed to close the achievement gap and opportunity gaps wherever it's been tried. Why would hedge fund managers and other aristocratic reformers like to see chartering taken out of the hands of democratically elected government officials and local communities and instead handed over to a politically appointed board? Aristocratic reformers are focused on a few elites being in control of districts and schools rather than democratically controlled education policy. Disingenuously, they simultaneously promote elegant but false narratives of civil rights and economic efficiencies as benefits of their top-down approaches. However, what the anti-democratic policies really offer is the opportunity for elites to profit handsomely from the education system by privately controlling the capital associated with our public school systems. As observed in Chicago and elsewhere, charter schools offer new opportunities to profit from sweetheart construction, land, and lease deals. They typically offer double and triple the rates of returns on bonds compared to traditional public schools. For-profit charter schools are able to skim dollars from the education of every single child. Some charters have even become lucrative vehicles for creating income based on loopholes in immigration laws. Across the spectrum, aristocratic policies are constructed so that the few elites control the education policy rather than communities. For example, if the home rule takeover of the entire district in Dallas had succeeded, a politically appointed board would have then had control of a $1 billion budget, likely without direct democratic public oversight or accountability. So what is the alternative to aristocratic school reforms? I posit it's democratically controlled, community-based education reform. Here are a few examples. When I first left graduate school at the University of Michigan, I was enticed to the Houston Independent School District. And when I had my interview at the district, I was told, we have some schools that have 0% dropout rates, and we're talking about urban schools. We've closed the achievement gap. We have had a miracle here in Texas for the education system. Now, 20 years on, we realize Texas never had a miracle, and that No Child Left Behind clearly has not worked. A test-based accountability system controlled from Washington and state capitals has not closed the achievement gap. It has not closed the opportunity gap. So the question is, what is the alternative to a top-down accountability approach? Well, California has something called local accountability. Accountability and school finance have always been intertwined. And so the question is, can we do accountability in a way that's bottom-up? And so what California has done with their new local accountability system is at a county level and at the local level, communities develop their own accountability plans. They're held accountable to the plans that are developed by communities, focusing specifically on students that are foster children and other special populations. There's a carrot now that goes with that stick, because if the communities meet the goals that they set based on a set of defined approaches that the state has laid out, then they receive additional funding to meet the actions that they've stated in their local accountability plans. So there is an alternative, community-based, democratic way to do accountability. And another important component of this is dashboards, which is that when you go to buy a car, I'm actually thinking about buying a car in the next few weeks, the question is, do you only judge the car based on what kind of rims it has? Or do you consider the car for a variety of characteristics? So the problem is that right now our assessment of schools, districts, even teachers, whether students go to the next grade, is based on just evaluating the rims or just evaluating one characteristic, which is a high-stake exam. But we have a lot of other data that we can now consider. People are interested in, for example, what are the school disciplinary rates in various high schools? What are the number of students that are attending career and technology programs? How do our kids do after their first year in college? There's a whole set of data that we could create into community-based dashboards so communities could decide the information they're interested in. We believe that the high-stakes test is a proxy for what we care about in society, but that's not necessarily the case. Why not consider the information that we actually care about as a society instead of a test that is just a few questions a few times a year? Now, there's a lot of controversy around charter schools. I consider myself to be middle of the road. I've been called a charter lover, I've been called a charter hater, all in the same week. But I think the question is, how do we do charter schools right? There are ways that we can do charter schools in community-based ways. I think it's a fantastic idea. I heard about a charter school here in Massachusetts where Native Americans had opened the school and it has a more culturally appropriate and relevant curriculum for their kids. I think that's a great idea. So there are ways that we can do community-based charters. They don't have to be for-profit charters like the vast majority of charters are now in my home state of Michigan. They don't have to be charter schools that restrict equity and access like the charter schools that you often see in Arizona. We can do charter schools in a community-based way. They do not have to be for-profit. They do not have to be corporate. When I worked in the Houston Independent School District, I worked in the Research and Accountability Department, and my job was to create the assessment tools for different programs. I also did the accountability system. I did a variety of things for the district. But nowadays, if I was working in that department, I would probably be doing value-added models. So what are value-added models? This is the idea that somehow we can calculate the amount of benefit that a teacher gives to any particular student in any particular year. And that's aside from all the things that happens in that kid's life. But there are problems with these models. Like, for example, in a middle school in Austin, A teacher told me that 10 families have been deported. What do you think happens to a kid's achievement when their parent is deported? You think it goes up? And it goes down. This is a very traumatic event. But if those students, let's say, were all in one classroom, then the value-added model, what's that value-added model going to tell you about that teacher? That the teacher is a low-performing teacher, let's say, right? But that doesn't account for the things that are happening in kids' lives, right? And so the thing is that this is a top-down approach where someone in some office with some statistical model is going to tell you who the fantastic teachers are in every school. It's damn near impossible. So there are alternatives to assessing teachers. There's PAR, which is a very popular approach that has expert consultant teachers and has actual input from school and from expert teachers to evaluate the success of teachers. This is a community-based approach to the assessment of teachers and is an alternative to the top-down approach where someone like me sits in an office and calculates whether you're a high-performing or a low-performing teacher. In conclusion, Lawrence Lessig offered in his Cambridge Forum lecture that we need a war against fat cats to save democracy. I believe that this is also true to ensure the democratic control of schools in my generation and beyond. However, we know that this is problematic for politicians because our political system was already flooded with money from industrialists and financiers and captains of industry, and became even more corrupted when the U.S. Supreme Court empowered corporations and dark money to have unlimited speech via money. The fix is in, folks. Lessig characterized this problem as, quote, conflicting dependency within the system. The government does what the well-to-do desire, and it's wholly unrelated to what the people want. Lessig also argued that a war against people who believe we have a right to control everything our government does is necessary. We need a war against people who believe they have the right to control our education policy in anti-democratic ways and control everything our schools do. In Lessig's conclusion, he told a story of a brave soul who spoke up at a White House garden party that the president should reprioritize limiting the increasing influence of elites and dark money in American democracy. He called him a skunk at the garden party. I'll be a skunk at the garden party. Will you stink it up with me? Thank you.
Okay, you're listening to the Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion of privatizing education and the health of democracy. So what are your suggestions? What do I do from the classroom? Because I'm not as rich. They are obviously much richer than I am and much more powerful. So what can I do with families and other teachers to combat this?
It's time for people power. So the only way that we can fight back against sort of these aristocratic reformers, I think, is by being very organized and concise. I also don't think we have to have a very positive message. It's not that we're saying no to school reform. We're just saying no to this type of school reform. So first, let me give you some kudos to you that are here from Massachusetts and New York. I was looking at the TIMSS crosswalk data, which is the math and science, and what they found is that Massachusetts and New York, if they were countries, would perform in the top 5 in the world in math and science. And this report was buried. So Massachusetts and New York and several other states are doing quite fantastic. Even Texas, they are 7th in math, ahead of Finland, in fact, if they were a country, right? But compared to the rest of the United States, they're about the middle of the pack, right? So I think that's the first thing to know, is that actually we're doing quite a darn good job. Now, the problems in our system actually have to do with the inequalities in our system. And you know what? We're really aware of the inequalities. One of the things that I do when I do keynotes is I say, close your eyes and imagine a city. Any city. It could be Boston, but it could be another city. Now, think about the really beautiful schools in that town, that city, that place. Who goes to those schools? Now think about the not-so-nice schools in that city and who attends those schools. And that explains to you what's really going on in society right now, is that there's huge inequality. We know about it. We're okay with it. But we're always looking for these inexpensive, cheap education reforms that folks can profit off of. But we know what's really going on in our system is that there are structural inequalities built into the system. Some kids get a better education than others on purpose, or maybe accidentally on purpose. So I think that that's one thing that we have to think very, very carefully about, because you could toss 100 other programs out at me, right? And the thing is that when somebody asks me a question and I don't really want to talk about what it is that they asked me about, I'm going to change the subject, right? And because we don't want to talk about this inequality in our societies, that certain kids, poor kids, whether they be rural white kids, whether they be urban Latino minority Asian kids, because we don't want to talk about that, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about test prep. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about charter schools. When what's really going on is we as a society know that some kids are going to what one kid told me, a burro school. They know that. They know that society is giving them the short end of the stick.
That was certainly the case in my school that closed down. There were many of the neediest students, because everyone was invited to come to the charter, but it seemed at the end of the day, once our school closed, that many students who needed consistency and not to go to a new school were the ones who left, didn't even go to the charter school, or very soon after left in droves and droves from our school. So it's kind of that repeated thing that's happened throughout Boston. Even when the same charter company opened another charter school in Boston, they said they could not do a certain special ed program, so all of those students went back into the district. And actually, when they closed our school, there were the students who were in what we called the BEST program. It was an acronym, but these are students who were multi-handicap. And I talked directly to the CEO, and he said, no, we can't take those students in, whereas all of the other Boston schools take all of the students, so it's just repeated.
So I'm not an attorney, but I suspect that they would have a case against that charter school, especially if he said that, because as public schools, they're required to serve those special ed kids. But oftentimes we know that charter schools will try to counsel them out and say, oh, you'll be better served at your traditional public school because we don't have the resources to serve you. Now, that being said, there are some charter schools that, for example, I visited Making Waves Charter School in California, in the Bay Area, and they spend $1 million on special ed every year. And the reason why they're able to do that is they have big-time donors. But not every charter school has that ability to do that. And then this is what you see. And it's not just for special ed kids, it's for ELL kids. The Justice Department was investigating charter schools in Louisiana for not serving students who speak Spanish. And they had testers that would call the charter schools and ask to enroll in Spanish. And the charter schools would hang up on them, they would laugh at them, all these different sorts of things that the testers discovered. And so this is I think a very important piece, which is charter school accountability, not just on test scores or what a fantastical percent of your students applied to college, but also providing equity and access for all students. Because if they don't, then are they truly public schools? Are they just public schools in name only, operating and acting like private schools?
Okay, well, you are listening to the Cambridge Forum. I'm Susie McGlone, a Boston school teacher, speaking with education policy expert Julian Vasquez Heilig about the role of public education in fostering a healthy democracy. Now let's take some questions from the audience.
I'm a city councilor here in Cambridge, and we spend roughly $11 million a year funding charter schools out of our city budget, independent of what the school department spends.
Sure.
And yet, when we look at charter schools, we see that because they don't have to take kids, I believe, after 9th grade, their enrollment tend to plummet in actually 9th, 10th, and 11th, but certainly 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, whereas our local schools, the district schools, and the state average stay high. And so we have very small classes in the charter school, senior, junior, sophomore grades, and bigger classes, or at least bigger class sizes, in the public schools. So when we talk about performance, we're not really comparing apples to apples or oranges to oranges, and I don't know how to have that discussion so everyone realizes charter schools aren't really the same thing as what typically is considered to be a public school. And I would appreciate any advice you have on that. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So there's a really interesting paper that was published in Teachers College Record by Kevin Wellner. It's called The Dirty Dozen. And it's a dozen ways that charter schools get rid of kids. And this particular one is what they call creaming and cropping, which is that, well, you're just not cut out to be here at Basis Charter School, or we can't serve your particular needs here, et cetera. And so you see the cumulative percentage, is what us statisticians call it, of students by grade cohorts go down so that, and this is a problem, of course, that we have in traditional public schools too. You see 9th and 10th grades are much larger than 11th and 12th grades, but it's clearly not as egregious as what you see in some of these charter schools that subscribe to this approach. Now, the 9th grade piece probably is Massachusetts-centric. The charter school laws are really different state to state. And there actually has been a debate over the last couple of weeks whether charter schools should require what they call backfill those students after they leave. But even if they're backfilling, by which process would they select those students? Because if those students that they're backfilling are still selective, then when you're comparing traditional schools and public schools, then you'd still be comparing apples to oranges, because they would have a selection process by which those students would go in. So, this is an ongoing debate. So first, I think that it's problematic for schools that push students out the door that are quote-unquote not cut out for their charter schools. I think that's a really big issue, whether they be special ed or just other students that they didn't follow the student code of conduct or parent contract or whatever. And then secondly, I think we need to debate this whole idea of backfilling. Is this appropriate if we're spending the money and you're spending, did you say 10 million? I can't really remember what 11 million. Should those charter schools be fully enrolled? I think those are important questions. Another interesting thing that came up this last week is In the Public Interest from DC came out with a 12-point plan for charter school accountability in the public interest. So I would Google that and check out that 12-point plan too. It's very interesting. What's also interesting about that is they did a poll of voters asking them what school choice is. What would they choose? Number 1, parental involvement. Number 2, extracurriculars, PE, art, music. Number 3, less testing. Number 4, higher quality teachers. Number 5, charter schools. That's way down there towards the bottom, right? But because we don't have the resources to offer the things that parents actually want in schools, we're having this conversation about charter schools. Yes.
I'm originally from Raleigh, North Carolina, and the school system that I grew up in had a really unique model in which it sort of bussed students around the district in order to make sure that every school had no more than a certain percentage of students in poverty. And people in Raleigh were pretty happy with that system, and I found it to be a great environment to grow up in, and of course it's since been dismantled. But my question is, when we're trying to propose alternatives to these charter reforms and these aristocratic reforms, are there any other success stories that we should be aware of to bring up to try to shift the discussion?
I think this is an important question. The Supreme Court weighed in on this too, and parents involved, where on the West Coast, Washington, they said that you couldn't use race to desegregate schools anymore. Our wonderful Supreme Court. But there are places that have thought of community-based solutions to that very issue. I think one of the challenges is that our legislators, I'm just going to be honest with you, a lot of black legislators went to schools that were mostly black, and so they see that as okay. And I think a lot of white legislators went to schools that were mostly white, and so they see that as okay. I went to a fairly diverse schools growing up, and so to me, that's what I see as normalcy and normal. But I think if we want folks to interact in a diverse and an increasingly diverse society, places like Texas, California, they're now a majority minority, then folks need to go to school with each other. And there are ways to do that. For example, one way to avoid the Supreme Court on the whole issue of race gets to what you're saying, which is income. And they use census tracts to desegregate their schools based on income, because as we know, there's a high rate of correlation by race and income. And so there are community-based ways, but communities have to have the will to do that. We know that districts are highly gerrymandered, and those district lines in many states go back to the 60s, to the 50s and before. If you look at the district lines in places like Texas, where they carve out little areas, those were all gerrymandered districts based on race. And so we have to decide if we have the willpower to have students of different types to attend school together. I think that's still an open question. I think the baby boomers did an okay job on this. I'm hopeful that my generation, as we start to segue into positions of responsibility, that we do an even better job than the baby boomers did.
My daughter's going into 5th grade, and that's the age that she can put her name into the lottery for charter schools. And we live in a neighborhood where they recruit, I call it recruitment, where they recruit from. And it's amazing to get their materials in the mail, because every single one of them says that they graduate 100% of their students.
Sure.
No one graduates 100% of their students, but they graduate 100% of their students.
Right.
And even in the schools that I know their statistics cold, it's just a lie. It's just a lie.
Well, they graduate 100% of the
Who
students
stay.
who stay, right?
Right.
So we looked at this attrition in Texas for charter schools. And what we found was that charter schools had double and triple the attrition, and we were specifically looking at black students, double and triple the attrition of traditional public urban districts. When we looked at the data from around 2000 and 2010 was, I think, the grade span, we saw that 40% of African Americans had left the KIPP schools. Now, KIPP might tell you that they have 100% college and graduation rate, they might not. But the bottom line is you can look at the attrition data and see a lot of students leaving the school. And they leave schools for all different sorts of reasons. But really what they're saying is that 100% of 60%
Right.
graduated, right? Which is not 100% in my stats class, right? So, yeah, so they'll graduate 100% of who's left.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, within this, I'm in a parent group working on issues around equity and accessibility in the Boston Public Schools. I guess I'm really asking for really concrete, what is like our first steps in trying to win this battle? It feels impossible, I have to say, but what would those first steps be?
Well, I think there's a lot of things we've talked about. I think one, you've got to pester your state reps. State representatives are usually pretty accessible, but everything has to go through the House, right? A little more difficult to get in the office of your state senator. Write letters, work with other organizations that you know are in town. Use social media to your advantage. Write op-ed letters to the newspaper. Write emails to the reporters. There's just a fantastic person in Houston, I'm not going to put her name in the public space, who emails folks behind the scenes enormous amounts of information about charters, choice. So I've been thinking about ways that I can also collaborate with folks like that I know in Texas and develop those relationships so that we can be advocates and conduct research that's applicable to the context that communities are thinking about so that you can weaponize that research in the conversations that you're having on social media with legislators, et cetera.
Hi, I taught school for 42 years, public school. My question is this: the people that you've referenced and that we critique, and these people, it seems to me, are kind of stunningly unreflective about their own educational experiences. So I'd like to ask you, what got you into this business?
You know, I come from a line of educators. My grandmother was a librarian for many years in an urban middle school, and my aunt was a superintendent and a teacher and a principal, and my uncle was a Brown Beret. So I guess activism, education, advocating for those in our system who historically have been underserved was in my blood. I'm also a big supporter of teacher organizations because my great-grandfather was a United Mine Worker, my grandfathers were UAW, my mother was Michigan Nurses Association. It's just also in my blood. So I want to thank each and every one of you for coming, and thank you for the questions, and please tweet at me. Please check out my blog, Cloaking Inequity, and I'm always open to questions over email if you have any of those. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian Vasquez Heilig. You have been listening to a program of the Cambridge Forum recorded in March 2015, co-sponsored by Mass Humanities and the Massachusetts Cultural Council. For information about this forum entitled Privatizing Education, featuring Julian Vasquez Heilig, or about our Forum Network webcast, visit us at cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Susie McClone. Thanks for joining us.